everyone. Okay, thanks for being on our webinar today. I think we'll get started because we have a lot to cover today. My name is Molly Culton. Let me share my screen really quick so you can see what we're talking about. Oh. All right, I'm an organizer with Sierra Club California, and today we're going to talk about conservation in San Francisco Bay and threats to the ecosystem, focusing primarily on the threat from the proposed single tunnel project. Brandon Dawson, who is our lead policy advocate on water issues, will be giving a detailed presentation on the San Francisco Bay ecosystem, as well as information on the proposed Delta conveyance project and what you can do to help protect this important resource. We want to make sure that the style and format of this presentation is more of a conversation rather than a lecture, so we'll take a pause every couple slides and allow for questions. If you have a question, feel free to use the chat box feature and type your question into the chat box, or use the raise hand feature and I can unmute you and you can ask your question. For today's webinar, since we are now at capacity, it might be better to use the chat box feature since there's so many people on. Okay, I will hand it off to Brandon.
Hey Molly, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Hi everyone, this is Brandon Dawson, Water Policy Advocate for Sierra Club California. Can you switch to the next slide, please? So today we're going to talk a bit about the San Francisco Bay, specifically where it's at and what lives there, such as fish and wildlife and whatnot. And then we'll get into some issues that are affecting the bay, primarily pollution, wetland degradation, and climate change. And then we'll go straight into the single tunnel project and what it is and why it's bad for the bay. And then we'll talk about some alternatives to the tunnel that the state can employ. So the Bay Delta, you probably hear a lot about the Bay Delta, and it's named so because it comprises of two major water systems, the San Francisco Bay and the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. Together, the two make up the largest natural estuary on the west coast of both North and South America, and they drain water from approximately 40% of California. The map on the left shows the entirety of that watershed where that 40% of water is drained. And that's from the Sacramento River watershed in the north in the dark green, the San Joaquin River watershed in central California in orange, and then the Tulare Lake Basin watershed in southern San Joaquin Valley in light green. The portion outlined on this map, if you look closely in black, is considered the legal delta, and that portion lies directly west of the San Francisco Bay. So this webinar focuses on the ecosystem of the bay portion of the estuary, or the lower estuary, as indicated on the map on the right. So the San Francisco Bay is both a bay and an estuary. And for those of you unfamiliar with those terms, a bay is an inlet coastal body of water directly connecting to a larger main body of water. And then an estuary is an area where freshwater river or stream meets the ocean, which is highly saline, as we all know. So the bay is fed by runoff of the Sierra Nevadas and Southern Cascade mountain ranges. And in natural conditions, water from those mountain ranges would run off, be freshwater, obviously, and flow through the delta. And then those delta flows would flow westward and eventually combine with salt water in the Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay is made up of 4 smaller bays. The farthest upstream is the Suisun Bay, which includes a vast area of marshes. Suisun Bay lies just below the confluence of the delta, so where the Sacramento and the San Joaquin rivers meet. And its neighbor, the San Pablo Bay, also known as the North Bay, are surrounded mostly by rural areas and are strongly influenced by the fresh water that flows from the delta into the Bay Area. The Central Bay, as indicated on this map, is the deepest and saltiest of the 4 bays, and cities and industries mostly occupy the shores of this area. And then lastly, the more shallow South Bay extends southwards into the quiet backwaters of the Bay Area. And it's mostly restored marshes, salt ponds, and then there's some areas for office parks and lagoon communities as well. So with it being a highly saline yet filtered by freshwater system, fresh waters that are flowing into it, the Bay Area has a number of mini ecosystems that as a whole act as a rich and unique area and habitat for fish, birds, and other wildlife. The Bay Area provides critical habitat for shorebirds, waterfowl, marsh birds, and as well as over 500,000 species of fish, mammals. Sorry, 500, not 500,000. That'd be ginormous. 500 species of fish, mammals, and plants, many of which are either threatened or endangered. More than 70 native fish species can be found in San Francisco Bay, and many of these species are transient or short-term visitors from nearby oceans or freshwater habitats. And some migrants, such as the Chinook salmon or sturgeon, cross through the bay into the ocean where they begin their spawning process and reproduction process from rivers. And then 33 species of native fish are completely dependent on the bay, so they live and they raise their young there as well. The bay is also a critical stopover point along the Pacific Flyway, which is a migration route for shorebirds and waterfowl. And in some years, that number can be over 1 million birds at the height of migration. The Bay Area consists of includes three Audubon designated important bird areas because of the high number of rare and endangered bird species that flow through that area and the sheer number of shorebirds and waterfowl that are supported from the bay and its ecosystem and its surrounding wetlands.
All right, this is the first pause in our presentation for questions. So if you have any questions about anything that has been brought up so far, okay. Oh, sorry, Leanne. There's a comment from Leanne. Can we begin with a moment of silence for all the Black lives lost at the hands of police? Yes, I think that is a great idea, and I'm sorry I didn't see that earlier. So let's just take a moment of silence and think about those lives lost. Okay. And we have another comment. Nancy, everyone's audio is muted, but if you raise your hand and you have a question, then I can click on your mic and unmute you so you can ask your question. So there's two ways. You can raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can just type your question into the chat box. And yes, Michael, that is the chat feature, and I see that comment. So we have a question from Jeff. What species of sea was that in the pic? I've never seen that one around here before. I think he means seal, the seal in that picture, Brandon.
I'm not too familiar. That picture is from our counterparts at Baykeeper, and I would have to follow up with them and get that answer for you.
Okay. And then Catherine says that she can only hear our video, but she can't see our slides. Is that an issue for anyone else? Can everyone else see the slides? Is anyone else having an issue with that? Okay. Okay, good. That's good to know. Thank you all who responded. Catherine, if you're having an issue, this webinar will actually be recorded and available on our website, which I'll give more information about that later. All right, and then a question from Ronald. Is there anything being done in a manner of water rights purchased for the bay? Say a farmer might be willing to sell water rights and they could be used to restore fresh water in the bay.
Yes and no. So the state has a process in terms of having to mandate how much water flows through the delta ecosystem and out to the bay. And that's not necessarily through a selling process, I guess. It's not, well, some of it could be voluntary, but it's not really like a sale. It's more so the water board has to figure out what's a sufficient amount of flows that could sustain the ecosystem and also provide for enough water for other beneficial uses within the delta. And that kind of dictates what's happening with the bay outflow or delta outflow into the bay. And in terms of voluntarily like selling that water and giving up those water rights, I'm not too familiar that that occurs. I'm sure it does, but I'd have to do a little bit more research to give you a precise answer on which farmers in the delta are doing that and or not in the delta and what that process is currently like.
Yeah, and there will be follow-up too with y'all after this presentation. So with that, we have more to cover. So I'm going to continue on, and Alita says that it appears to be a harbor seal. So, all right,
Thank you.
let's continue.
Cool. So now we're going to talk about some issues in bay waters. Over the past century, the San Francisco Bay has faced severe challenges that have threatened the health of the ecosystem, so the fish, wildlife, and the residents within the Bay Area as well. A lot of these issues can be attributed to a lack of freshwater flows, also known as delta outflow, and I'll be using that term a lot in this presentation, due to the management of California's two elaborate large water management and delivery systems, the Federal Central Valley Project, which is operated by the feds, and then California State Water Project as well. In an average year, the two systems pump nearly 5 million acre feet of fresh water from the Delta, and that number in the highest years can be up to 6.5 million acre feet. And just for reference, of some of you unfamiliar with exactly how big an acre foot is, it's the amount of water that is needed to cover about a football field, 1 foot deep in water. And it's also the same amount of water that is enough to sustain two families of four for up to a year. This is water that's pumped out. That water would naturally have flowed through the delta and out into the bay and out to the Pacific. So just imagine that water, how much water is being taken away from that area and from the ecosystem. So I'm going to discuss three specific issues impacting the bay: pollution, tidal marsh degradation or wetlands degradation, and then also climate change. So the San Francisco Bay is bombarded with pollution from various sources. One of the most prevalent sources is stormwater pollution, and that's detailed in the graphic on the right. And stormwater pollution refers to rainwater that falls on the regional landscape and flows down hillsides and through urbanized lowlands, eventually captured in either storms, drains, creeks, or channels that flow into the bay rivers, and then those rivers eventually flow into the Bay Area itself. This type of runoff is one of the largest sources of pollution. And what it does is it carries those, when it rains, that water carries trash, oil, pesticides, fertilizers, household chemicals, and other toxic pollutants that may be on the street that are washed into the creeks and sloughs. This also occurs upwards of the Bay Area and in the Delta area as well. Um, and all of that pollution and all of that water that's flowing into these riverways and these channels and whatnot are flowing into the bay itself without being treated or filtered. So it gets concentrated. And it's gotten so bad that many Bay Area creeks can't support any healthy fish populations because of how much pesticides and fertilizers and other pollution is in there. Another source of pollution is also the dredging and disposal of dredge material in the Bay Area, illustrated by a barge. That can be illustrated by the barge that's on the left of the slide. And so the Bay Area, as I'm sure many of you know, is a critical area for business and maritime, and it supports a wide variety of uses, which include things such as international trade to commercial and recreational fishing, as well as just recreation itself. And as these uses increased over time, as the Bay Area got more populated, dredging of the bay occurred to make sure that it was deep enough for the channels and the ports to be at a level sufficient for vessels to navigate within that area. So while the water at Golden Gate Bridge is over 300 feet deep, most of the Bay Area is actually less than 18 feet deep. So when you're dredging, you're basically you're taking out a lot of that sediment and a lot of that the bottom of the bay, and you're kicking that up. And what you're doing is you're kicking up pollutants that have sat in contaminated water and contaminated sediment for an unknown period of time. And then what you're also doing is you're moving that sediment and disposing of it somewhere elsewhere in the bay. So then those pollutants are transported to other areas that weren't initially polluted or had less pollution. And so in an average year since 1990, over 3 million cubic yards of sediment has been dredged from the bay. And that means that transport of pollutants occurs pretty regularly. The next is some tidal marsh degradation, also known as wetlands. So a tidal marsh is a type of wetland found along rivers, coasts, and estuaries, which floods and drains by the tidal movement of the larger waterway that it's within, so either estuary, a sea, or an ocean. And tidal marshes, like many wetlands, not just these specific ones, have very valuable ecosystem services, right? So you can see that tidal marshes and wetlands generally provide for flood protection for homes and businesses. They also filter out stormwater pollution and stormwater runoff, which is a type of pollution we discussed on the previous slide. And then they also provide habitat for birds and waterfowl and nurseries for fish and shellfish that are food for those birds and waterfowl as well. And then they also provide a key component in the carbon sequestration process, so helping to counter the climate crisis. Over the last 150 years, the bay's tidal marshes have been seriously degraded due to either reduced sediments flowing into the bay or development along those shorelines. And what I mean by reduced settlements flowing into the bay is a lot of that fresh water that flows from the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas and southern Cascade Mountain ranges contains sediments, so little particles of soil and rock and whatnot, and that flows through the delta and then it flows into the bay and it builds up these wetlands and allows for more habitat and more of their beneficial uses to be kind of um, grown. But with you have less fresh water flowing through, you're not allowing as much sediment to flow through. Um, by 1950, actually, an estimate of only 50,000 acres of wetlands remained in the Bay Area itself, and a quarter, which was a quarter of what was historically thought. And as of 2017, only about 8% of the bay's original tidal marshes remained viable. If you look on this slide, you'll see that a lot of those wetlands are being restored through practices from either local governments or conservation groups itself. But that's only a fraction of what was originally within the bay. And then lastly, climate change. So climate change impacts, as many of you know, also have impacts that inevitably affect the bay ecosystem. And when I mention climate change, sea level rise is probably the phenomenon that came to your mind. And with regard to San Francisco Bay and sea level rise has been a natural process which filling in the bay over the course of several 100,000 years, right? So according to some scientists, at the peak of the Ice Age, which was approximately around 18,000 years ago, sea levels in the Bay Area were about 120 meters lower than what they are today, and the shoreline extended beyond the Farallon Islands, which are around 20 miles east of the current coastline, south of Point Reyes, and 30 miles west, and 30 miles west of the Golden Gate. So, in recent years, sea level rise has increasingly been higher, and it's been estimated by some state officials that the Bay Area could see an increase in 36 inches by the year 2100. Aside from the human impacts that will be felt on sea level rise, many people will have to move more inland. Sea level rise will have a devastating impact on the ecosystem of the bay because that water pushes more highly saline water inland, and it reduces the amount of brackish and freshwater habitats in the upper portion of the bay and in the delta. So it drowns those tidal marshes that I talked about earlier, and it also doesn't provide. It also like kills off a lot of the fish and wildlife species within the freshwater habitat. So each of these issues that I spoke about could be mitigated and their impacts could be reduced if we had more water, which is delta outflow, flowing through the delta into the bay and out into the Pacific. Obviously, in conjunction with other policies that local governments in the state need to employ. But if you think about it, delta outflow, an increase in that will provide more fresh water into the bay, which allows for more pollutants to be more of those concentrated pollutants to be flushed out that have built up over time. It allows for more sediment into the bay, which forms those tidal marshes and beaches. It makes the bay waters more turbid, which in turn, turbidity is like the amount of visibility that you could see within the water. So highly turbid water acts as kind of a protectant for fish and invertebrates. And when you have very clear water, then then predators can easily spot fish and invertebrates and then kill off high numbers of those fish species as well. So increased outflow, however, doesn't necessarily address like development within the bay itself, which is also a contributing factor to why wetlands are being degraded within the Bay Area. And the development question is a question for planning commissions and cities within the local sphere of government. Um, and lastly, an increased delta outflow will also provide more fresh water in the bay that reduce the impacts of climate change by countering that saltwater intrusion that lurches up higher onto higher into the delta. Obviously, the sea level, like I said, sea level rise has been estimated to increasingly come inland, and it's not necessarily that freshwater flows would combat this, but it would allow for more freshwater to be at least in the areas within the bay itself where freshwater habitat and brackish water habitat is necessary to mitigate some of those impacts when sea level rise does occur. So increasing delta outflow would seem to be a pretty good solution, or at least one of the solutions that can put off a lot of those impacts that are occurring within the bay due to just different issues. But as we'll talk about after a short Q&A next, the state's actually employing measures that reduces delta outflow and only exacerbates those impacts and these issues within the bay itself.
All right, everyone, we're going to take another break here for questions. Like I said, if you have a question, type it into the chat box. That's probably the easiest way to do this since there's so many of you on. Alita, I just see that you have raised your hand. So I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question. All right, Alita, you're unmuted.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you are.
Hello.
Will these slides be available to print out?
Yes, I can send them to you in the follow-up as a PDF attachment if you want them. They are available for distribution.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna unmute you. There you go. All right, let's see if anyone has any other questions. You can use the raise hand feature. Apparently, I am seeing that. And Heinrich, I see you. I'm gonna unmute you. Hi, Heinrich.
Hi. Actually, I raised my hand quite a while ago, and you've resolved the question. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Heinrich. Okay, let's see. I think we got some questions in the chat box here. There's quite a few. I meant to ask folks if your question is more of a comment to refrain from sharing that until the end of the presentation, because it might be something that we'll touch on later in the presentation. So there are a lot of questions here.
You can ask like one or two of them. I can.
Question from Michael. What is the Sierra Club's perspective on the function and viability of CalFed in the Delta?
I think we're going to get into that actually within the coming slides. So stay tuned. And if I don't answer your question, specifically what you're looking for, then I would be happy to follow up offline.
Yeah, there will be follow-up after this presentation too for any questions that need to be answered after the presentation. Agnes has a question. Who is responsible for ensuring the amount of fresh water in the Delta is sufficient to support the Delta habitat, given it is such a big source for California water?
Very important question, very hard to answer question, but short answer, the State Water Resources Control Board is the entity responsible for making sure that all of California waters, so not just the Delta and the Bay, but all of California waters are equally distributed, but also have the water quality of that water is maintained enough to, like I said earlier, meet beneficial uses. And so one of those ways to do that is by regulating the amount of flow necessary to either to meet the supply necessary for all Californians, but also to make sure that the water quality is up to par as well and meets either the Federal Clean Water Act standards or our own state Port of Cologne standards as well. So, but a lot of entities, right, are once the State Water Board puts out those regulations or says kind of what should be the amount of water sufficient to do that, then it's back down to the individual actors. And so agriculture industry, cities and municipal industries, but also personal farmers in the North Delta and whatnot, and in Northern California generally, they're the ones that have to comply with that essentially. And so it's kind of like a shared responsibility among Californians, but primarily it's the State Water Resources Control Board.
Awesome. All right, and we have a good question here from Margot. You talked about tidal marsh degradation and the restoration of such. How does that correlate to the expected sea level rise, and are these two competing efforts?
That is a good question. Thanks for that, Margot. I think a lot when I'm answering this cautiously because I'm not super familiar with Sierra Club's efforts in wetland restoration within the Bay Area. I know Save the Bay, obviously, but also um, San Francisco Baykeeper, for example, have been doing a lot on this. And I believe, and please someone follow up with me offline if you're part of those organizations or if you're part of the Sierra Club Bay Area chapter and you know way more about this than I do. Please follow me up online. But I believe that a lot of the tidal marsh and wetland restoration within that area doing is taking sea level rise into account in terms of how they're restoring those wetlands. And so some of them are adding more sediment and um, more area within to those wetlands that kind of counterbalance what's going to be happening. And so you'll see like more water comes up, it won't necessarily be flooding those wetlands anymore because those wetlands have been elevated or raised or whatnot, kind of like building up, and not necessarily getting to the point where they're like sea walls or anything. But they're still providing a like major ecosystem habitat and area for people to either visit and kind of recreate within, but also having their intended duty of having all of those benefits that I talked about earlier. I think that answers your question. I'm sorry if it doesn't, or if I'm just completely wrong. I'd be happy to follow up, like I said.
All right, and then we'll do one more question before we move on because we still have the rest of the presentation. But is more sediment due to outflow good or bad?
Um, Good, because short answer, it's good because it provides for more buildup within those wetland areas, and also provides for more turbid waters for fish and wildlife species. Um, it, if the like they're eventually what those wetlands, regardless, are not because of just how things are, will be like there will see some erosion on those wetlands and whatnot, but it needs that sediment flowing out to offset that, right? So that's why it's good. But when you have diversions, which is what we're going to talk about next, you're taking away a lot of that sediment that would have been used to offset that natural erosion that occurs.
All right, awesome. So we're going to continue on with the webinar presentation and talk about the threat from the Delta Conveyance Project.
Cool. So before the Q&A, and as some people mentioned just now in the Q&A itself, the state's has a proposal to reduce the amount of water that actually flows out into the bay from the delta, so reduce in delta outflow, and that way would their way of doing this would be through the Delta Conveyance Project, which is just one of many projects that have been around for decades. So um, since the 1940s, Central Valley farmers and water agencies / wholesalers south of the Delta have pressed for increasingly more water to be diverted from the Delta and sent south, either via a large canal or a tunnel underground. So the first instance of this, and it was first proposed in the 1940s, and then as the State Water Project was kind of built up in the 1970s and the 1960s and 70s, um, a part of this became known as the Peripheral Canal, which was supported by Governor Jerry Brown in his early terms as governor in the 1970s and 1980s. Luckily, in 1982, voters like yourself resoundingly rejected this proposal, the Peripheral Canal, in a statewide ballot measure. And so that canal would have moved that water from Northern California rivers around the Delta to Southern and Central California river areas. And so back when Governor Brown came back into office in 2010, I believe, in 2013, a similar proposal was released under the name of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which was a plan consisting of two components. So you had a restoration of the ecosystem component and habitat, and then you also had a component that purported to improve water conveyance. The conveyance portion of that project proposed constructing two massive tunnels to divert the water in a similar fashion that I just talked about from the Sacramento River underneath the Delta, so a huge tunnel, and deliver that water again to either Central Valley farmers or water agencies and wholesalers south of the Delta. In 2015, that conveyance portion became known as what we now know as California Water Fix. And fortunately, due to fierce opposition from Sierra Club, but also other environmental groups within the Delta area and residents itself, Water Fix was met with fierce opposition. And by the time Jerry Brown left office in 2018, he was only considering building a single tunnel project, which is where we pick up now. So enter Governor Gavin Newsom's single tunnel project. So in his first State of the State address in 2019, Governor Newsom announced his support for a single tunnel, And accordingly, the Department of Water Resources, which is California's water management agency, water systems management agency at least, withdrew all their proposals for what I mentioned before, which was that California water fix proposal. And that occurred in May 2019. In January 2020, the department released a notice of preparation, which initiates the environmental review process under CEQA for this project. And it's just one of many processes that the project will have to go through. And according to that notice of preparation, but also discussions that have been happening at the Delta Construction and Design Conveyance Authority, which is a joint powers authority that's commissioned to oversee the construction and the design of the project. The tunnel is proposed to be about 40 miles long and it will be built 190 feet below the surface in the North Delta. And like its predecessors, it would be operated to divert freshwater flows from rivers feeding into the Delta, therefore thereby bypassing the Delta and bypassing any water that would then flow into the bay. That water, like its predecessors, would also be shipped to large farming operations in the Central Valley, but also water wholesalers south of the Delta. And the tunnel would have capacity to divert up to 6,000 cubic feet per second of water, which is the equivalent to nearly 45,000 gallons of water per second. Illustrated by the chart on the right, DWR has, and the DCDCA has identified two potential corridors for the Delta for this tunnel, one central corridor and one eastern corridor, but both corridors have major environmental and public health impacts for not only the Delta, but also the Bay Area itself. And the project is estimated to cost nearly $11 billion before inflation and before cost overruns. So it will take about 16 years to construct, and who knows what will happen as inflation increases in the economy, with the economy in that time period. So the tunnel will have a lot of impacts on the bay itself, the San Francisco Bay itself. It'll worsen conditions in the bay, primarily by decreasing the amount of fresh water that flows into the lower estuary and out into the Pacific. So it decreases freshwater flows by facilitating more diversions, right? So state policies, both Fed and state policies, along with what's happening within the California itself, kind of when you compound those, more water will be taken out of the bay. And it's interesting because with climate change, less water is actually being available to flow through the Delta and into the bay. So it will place excessive demands on the Delta River ecosystems that then accelerate bay degradation. So pollution and tidal mark degradation will continue if the tunnel's operated and built, or built and operated, and the ecosystem will ultimately deteriorate. The tunnel would also draw a lot of the bay's saltier waters into the northern delta, for reasons I stated earlier, right? So with less fresh water flowing through the delta, its channels will be shallower and slower moving, so the water would also be much warmer, and it allows those pollutants then to facilitate the growth of cyanobacteria that then morphs into these harmful algal blooms, which have toxic public health and environmental impacts. And it also allows conditions that would be detrimental to salmon, as they wouldn't be able to spawn. So as a result, California's commercial industry for salmon, which has major implications for the West Coast salmon industry, which it provides nearly $1.5 billion in economic activity, would be completely decimated. And also other fish species such as the Delta smelt and other fish species such as the sturgeon and steelhead would decline in numbers if they would survive at all. And lastly, the tunnel would also increase costs for South Bay areas, South Bay ratepayers whose water agencies are putting money up for the tunnel. The Santa Clara Valley Water Districts is a water district that supports the tunnel, and it will be putting some money up for that tunnel, but that money will then fall onto those ratepayers, and you'll see higher water bills and higher costs. And Valley Water District's rate projections already have planned for about a 7 to 8% water increase per year for the foreseeable future, and that's on top of what is necessary to fund the tunnel as well. So you could see as much as 15% water increase for the next 20 years, as far as people know, which ultimately falls onto those ratepayers in that area. So the tunnel is bad for the Bay Area, and it's purported to the state promotes it because it wants to solve two issues of kind of water reliability and combating climate change. And it's interesting because, as we're going to talk about now, there are a lot of alternatives that the state can do to to meet those goals of water reliability and combating climate change that are also less costly and way less environmentally harmful. And all of those kind of come down to one idea of promoting regional solutions. And those solutions really enhance local water projects that are efficient and environmentally beneficial, but also resilient in the face of climate change. They would reduce the need of long distance water transfers, which is in line with state policy and state law of the Delta Reform Act of reducing reliance on the Delta and degrading that ecosystem further. So on this slide, you'll see a myriad of examples that we propose as Sierra Club California, but also other organizations have proposed. And I'll take a few minutes just to discuss a few of those alternatives. One of those alternatives could be investing in water recycling projects that ensure a sustainable drought-proof water supply. So water recycling offers a significant untapped water supply, particularly in coastal areas like the Bay, which faces water shortages or in areas that rely on imported water generally in Southern California. So recycled water has been estimated to potentially meet nearly 1/3 of our California's total water supply needs. And it's a wise investment because it creates a local drought resilient water supply and reduces the need to import more water, which water systems that import water use a high amount of energy. So it also reduces greenhouse gas emissions and California's energy footprint as well. Another solution or alternative that the state can employ is promoting stormwater capture. So remember earlier I spoke about promoting stormwater pollution being a large source of pollution in the Bay. That stormwater can be captured and treated and then provide a new water source that reduces the need to use already potable water for landscaping needs or other needs within urban areas. That reduces the amount of pollution that then flows into the Bay and degrades it more. And while legislation has made it easier and more cost effective to increase rainwater capture and stormwater capture within local areas, the state needs to do a little bit more investing and promoting those uses, and also allowing for homeowners to install their own rainwater capture systems that they can then treat at home and use for their own needs. And lastly, something that the state could also do is look at the agricultural industry's water use. Investment in water conservation techniques in the agricultural industry could potentially limit a lot of the release of water that's either unused or kind of unfiltered at this point. It's been estimated that California's agricultural industry uses about 80% of our developed water supplies, and our being the state's total water supplies. And if the industry would just use increased irrigation, techniques that include increased irrigation efficiency, but also water saving practices such as using better soil and also crop selection, then we could potentially limit the amount of water that's necessary to have for that industry. So ultimately, a suite of prioritized actions is necessary to meet all of our goals within the state, but also Sierra Club California's goals as well. And with this, all of these goals would benefit the Bay itself because it allows for increased flows to be introduced within the Bay that then replenishes that ecosystem that's been dying over time. These and more alternatives can be found in our Sierra Club California's white paper titled Smart Alternatives to Tunnel, which was authored by members of our water committee, such as Chinook, and other Bay Area members as well, who have been within this fight for Bay replenishment and the Bay ecosystem for many years.
All right, and if y'all are wondering in what other ways you can get involved, you can sign up on our website to become part of our network of water activists. The website is www.sierraclub.org/California/volunteer, and talk to your friends and family members about what you learned today and invite them to sign on and get involved as well. And if you want more information, our fact sheets as well as these presentations will be available on our water website, which is www.sierraclub.org/California/water. Okay, so with that, we'll do one more final round of questions and answers. So if you have any questions about this, Michael, I see that your hand is raised. Is that still, I'm gonna unmute you.
No, I didn't have a question. I made a mistake.
Okay, good. So unmuted, or muted. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm going to the chat box. Okay, there's a lot in the chat box. so we have a question from Charles. Are there 2 proposed channels?
By channels, if you mean like kind of, if this is in reference to the tunnel itself, yes, there are 2 proposed corridors. One, like I said, one along the central delta, and then one along an eastern route in the delta. Both, yeah, Molly, could you go back to that slide? Perfect. Well, the one of the channels is the purple one, and I'm sorry if you're colorblind. The purple one is the eastern corridor, and the yellow one is the central corridor. Both of those have really bad public health and environmental impacts. So both of them completely decimate along a lot of the islands within in the delta. Specifically islands that house sandhill cranes and other birds that are flying along the Pacific Flyway. Primarily the one on the central corridor that's the one that decimates a lot of that wildlife. And then the one on the eastern corridor is actually closer to Stockton, which is the closest largest city within the delta, primary legal delta area zone. And it's about 3 to 4 miles west of Stockton, and all of that construction that will be occurring on that will have major public health impacts for the Stockton communities, specifically Southwest Stockton community, which is already an AB 617 community, meaning it has some of the worst air pollution within the state. And so much so that the state has identified it as one that needs a lot of mitigation and help to clean up their air. And if you're wondering why air gets implicated in this, it's because of a lot of that construction will kick up pollutants within the air, and then you have all of the construction equipment being moved in, which means more trucks and whatnot. And if you need a little bit more of a primer on exactly how bad construction will be for the tunnel, I highly suggest that you look at our website at the Delta Tunnel by the Numbers fact sheet. It has a good amount of information on the number of truck trips that will be used for this project, but also the amount of emittents and pollutants that will be kicked up and eventually be within that area.
Right, and Katya had a comment. Santa Clara Valley Water District does already have the Delta conveyance baked into their 8% per year rate increases, but the cost increases are likely to blow that away. It's only going to get more expensive.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Katya, for that.
Okay, so a question from Dahlia. Does degradation of the Delta affect marine mammals?
Yeah. So thank you for that question, Dahlia. So a lot of the orcas that live off the West Coast, and not just, well, and I'm sorry if I am incorrect in their terminology, but not just orca, just whales generally, that live off the West Coast and migrate along the West Coast, rely on a lot of those fish that migrate through the delta and out through the bay and into the ocean, right? So when you have degradation in the delta, you're allowing for less fish to live, which then affects the food system that those whales and those marine mammals rely on. And that's a huge issue as well. So, and one that we definitely have been discussing with Defenders of Wildlife, but also other marine mammal and wildlife groups out within the Bay Area as well.
Okay. So this webinar is supposed to go, we have until 2 p.m. and there are a lot of questions and comments, so I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll try. So we have a question from Juliana regarding Prop 1. It was recommended that the state should dedicate more money towards stormwater capture. Do you think that available grant monies for stormwater through Prop 1 and other stormwater related grants do not have enough money dedicated towards those kind of projects already?
Good question. And I'm sorry if I can't answer this. I started at Sierra Club, California a little over a year and a half ago, and I'm not super familiar with Prop 1. But what I can say is within the budget that the governor's proposed and the legislature is trying to figure out right now, there's no money really dedicated to those stormwater capture and those recycling projects. If any money at all, actually, now that I think about it, I'd have to go back and look. And I'm sure that there have been some grants that have been dispersed and whatnot, but I need to do a little bit more research to give you a full answer in terms of whether or not that's enough money to meet to sustain the necessary amount of water supply and environmental beneficial projects. We at Sierra Club California are advocating for more of that money to be used, if generally speaking, and more investment within those projects, whether through Prop 1, but also through other mechanisms that could be employed. So um, there are some funds that are currently going towards tunnel preparation and tunnel planning and whatnot that we think should be transferred to providing more money for this that the state could use, and then also through bond funds as well, not just Prop 1, but other potential bonds as well that are currently within the legislature.
All right, there's a comment from Steve that I'm particularly excited about unions. Usually building trade unions support such projects, but there are many union members like myself and other unions who would oppose these environment and climate destroying projects. What can I do to bring them into this struggle, and who should I contact about this? Steve, we'll definitely be following up with you offline about that more, particularly as it relates to our organizing efforts in Southern California. So you can expect us to be in touch with you on that.
Yeah,
Brandon,
definitely.
okay, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I will definitely be in touch with you about that. And if you want to do a little bit more research on that as well, I would reach out to Restore the Delta. They have a good,
Yeah.
they've been a good resources on how labor is going to be affected by this project, specifically construction jobs and what it means for the Stockton area, but also the Bay Area itself.
Yep.
So please reach out to them, and then we'll also be in touch to kind of talk to you about that, because that's an issue that we definitely have been trying to figure out.
Okay, and then a question from Ronald. Why doesn't the state have a steady conservation policy regarding water? Every few years we're told there's a drought and to conserve, and then the next thing they tell us is the drought is over. Shouldn't we live as if water needs to be conserved constantly?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. It's so the state has, I think in the past couple of years, the state has kind of put some restrictions on urban water conservation, and has trying to be promoting that more through legislation, but also other different practices. But it'll be some time before like we see the effects of that, right? So we also know with climate change, there will be longer droughts. It'll be hotter summers, and less water coming out in the and throughout flowing in the winter too. So the main question becomes, how can we kind of address that and adapt to that as necessary? And that then becomes a question of, are the efforts that we're doing now and are the efforts that we're employing now enough to meet those demands and to answer those questions of how can we combat those issues? So sorry if I sound like I'm rambling, but basically there is kind of a water conservation policy that the state has, but it's not strong enough, and we need to do more.
All right, and then a question from Patricia. Are there any studies of harm for reduction of freshwater flows? Studies would be useful in LA, such as the Bayona Wetlands freshwater diversion.
Yeah, Bayona Wetlands. Yes, there have been some studies about how much water is needed to flow into the bay, or just how much water is needed in the delta generally to sustain the life in the ecosystem. And the State Water Board is on record, not only State Water Board actually, State Water Board, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then I think this Estuary Institute, SF Estuary Institute, have all, oh, and also Delta Stewardship Council, all of those are have all said that there needs to be more water flowing through the ecosystem to sustain that ecosystem. And I would be happy to send you some of those links and some of those studies that have concluded such.
All right, and Jeffrey has a question, but it's also a bit of a comment. Jeffrey, we might want to follow up with you offline to address the rest of the things that you said, which we will do. But are there provisions in the single tunnel project that require certain minimum flow releases to natural channels in the delta?
I'm going to say no, and the only reason why I think that is because the Delta project doesn't, this is I'm trying to exactly figure out exactly how to answer this. So that tunnel project itself won't be something that, or at least this is how the state is marketing it. It won't be something itself which is like a new project. So it would be a piece of infrastructure that would facilitate flows into and from the already existing infrastructure. So they are saying that water rights and diversions wouldn't be any different if this project um, would be built or not. But that's not true because they're saying, and a Metropolitan Water District too is also saying that there's a lot of water available to flow through that tunnel, and that's why they need that tunnel is because it would provide for more water to be able to get through. So within the project itself, it's not going to have any permitting or diversions, like saying yes, it flows through this project. That would be dictated through the state water board's water rights process, and then the tunnel would be used to implement that water rights process, if that makes sense. And I'm sorry if I don't understand your question. I just completely botched
Yeah,
it.
and we can follow up with you, Jeffrey, offline as well once we send out the follow-up email. So I will be sending out an email to all of y'all who are on the webinar today with some more information and links. Are there any other questions that we didn't get to? You can use the raise hand feature at this time and I can unmute you, or you can type your questions into the chat box. If not, you know, you can ask your question in the follow-up and we will get back to you via email as well. So not seeing any other questions. Oh, here we go. Cheryl asked a question. How does this relate to the Bay Delta project?
This, if you mean like the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, this is the single tunnel project is the newest version of that plan, and this is all the Bay Delta is all implicated within this project. If that's what you mean. So when we say the Bay Delta, we mean the San Francisco Bay and the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta. Those are linked, and this project, the single tunnel project, affects both of those ecosystems. It takes water out of the delta that would have eventually flowed through the delta and into the bay.
What I mean is the flows through the Tuolumne River.
Oh, okay. So the Tuolumne River is one of the rivers that is a tributary to the San Joaquin River, and that's where and Heinrich, please, if you're still on, feel free to answer this question as well, since you're much more familiar with this. Is one of the tributaries that flows into the San Joaquin River, which is one of the major tributary rivers for the Delta, right? And the Tuolumne River is also one of the areas that is the area where a lot of San Francisco and the Bay Area gets their water sources from. So that becomes a question of it then becomes a question of how can you allow for more water to be released from the Tuolumne River into the San Joaquin River that flows through the delta to sustain that ecosystem, but also allowing for the amount of water necessary to meet the needs of the San Francisco Bay and its residents and whatnot. And there have been some voluntary agreement negotiations around that. And SFPUC, San Francisco Power, not Power, wait, is it Power? San Francisco's PUC, I can't remember the name of it, sorry.
Public Utilities Commission?
Thank you, yes. Public Utilities Commission, which regulates and does all of that for the San Francisco. They are a party to some of those negotiations and whatnot, but the problem is they're also combating against they've been combative against what the State Water Board has mandated is necessary to flow into the Delta ecosystem. So I don't want to give you any more wrong information if I've already given you wrong information. So I would please follow up with me in writing, and also I can give you the name of our lead water volunteer who works on that issue within the Bay, which is Heinrich, who's magnificent.
Yes. All right. Great. Cool, Patricia. Thank you for that comment. We look forward to following up. Okay, so we'll be in touch. Y'all, thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. Like I said, the slides are available. If you want them, just let us know and I can send you them. And this presentation will also, a recording of this presentation will also be available on our water website at a future date as well. All right, thanks so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.